There are people in the world who gain a sense of pleasure and delight from giving others pain. There are also people who derive a sense of pleasure and delight in feeling pain for themselves. These are deeply disturbed people generally, and you want to do whatever you can, if possible, to stay away from them unless you're trained on how to deal with them. Because if you don't have that kind of background and you encounter these people, you're going to get hurt. That's how it works. These are troubled people, and I don't want to make light of what can be, and in some cases is, an actual mental illness, a psychological disorder. These people create all kinds of difficulties in their relationships, and their own lives are not joyful and fulfilled, and they're not, I hate to use the word happy, but the truth is they are not happy people. And they seem to spread their unhappiness pretty much wherever they go. This idea of a psychological disorder is new. When the New Testament was written, there was no such thing. But there have been people like this, maybe since the third or fourth generation of mankind. Well, Peter, with indirectly addresses this kind of an issue a little bit. Okay, I know it's a stretch, but I had to have an introduction. When he in verse 13 of 1 Peter chapter 3, we talked about this before. Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Now that's a rhetorical question, and the answer rhetorically is, well, nobody, except, and then he goes on to answer in verse 14, but even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. This is a quotation from the book of Isaiah. Even if you should suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. In other words, just don't forget whose you are, who is in control, and who really is coordinating, in fact, already has coordinated events in life to conform to his design, and that's God. Now, I'm going to just tap into a little slice of a philosophical bent that might apply if you think of this in its broadest terms. So the reason I shouldn't be afraid of their threats or frightened by what they say or do if I have done good, even if I experience harm for that, is because this blessing that I receive from doing good will often, very often, go far beyond the moment that I'm in. And the only way that something that feels bad could ultimately be good is if it conforms to a bigger, better design and plan. Why this is a little bit dicey is that theologically, I believe God has given all of humanity free will. He's given us the choice to decide what we will or will not do. This is very important, and I think it's reflected in Genesis, in the account of Eve and Adam eating the fruit off forbidden fruit offered to them by Satan in the form of a serpent. They chose this out of their own free will. There was no compulsion one way or the other by an outside force. There was only the offer and the free will to choose to do or not do. That theme has carried out through the rest of time. And I see it in all of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament. Why that is difficult theologically is because of a little phrase in Romans 8, in verse 28. For God is at work for those who love him and are called according to his purpose to bring about good. No matter what, really, is the implication. That whatever bad might happen to us, God is at work to turn it for good. That his will is so broad because it stands outside of time that it can account for every act of free will by every human being for all of time. Big deal? Maybe not when you first think about it, but when you dwell on it very much, this is the only way that there could be a blessing in me being harmed for doing what is good. Because there has to be something bigger than my momentary, immediate experience. Otherwise, being harmed for doing good is just injustice. It simply makes me a victim of another person's free will. And if all you have is the moment you're in to make that judgment, then what else could you decide? If, though, there is a God who has a design and a will and his presence and being that is eternal and not locked in time, well, that permits. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. Threats are pretty much as good as the threatener. If somebody's holding a gun in front of me and threatens to shoot me, then that's a little bit different than somebody saying, don't make me come over there because I could hurt you. So you see where I'm going with this? When I read in Facebook, which, by the way, I'm trying to put that past I'm trying to set it in the past where I don't want to burn off hours of my life reading things that don't build me up or encourage me or, the 1% that is actually there that's good for me. It'll probably come in another form from another source, but okay. So where was I going with Facebook? Well, when I read about these extraordinary threats, everything from climate change to pandemic to economic failure and collapse to political failure and collapse, it can set up fear. But I have to bear in mind that the world makes all kinds of threats, and it can fulfill, a percentage of those threats. You can't just not pay attention, but there's this other thing about it that I have to bear in mind, and I want to encourage you to bear in mind, is nobody can act on a threat without God's permission. That doesn't help very much, does it? Unless you frame it up in this other concept that I just talked about, that God is so much bigger than the moment and so much bigger. His will is so much more dynamic and larger and capable. I don't even have the right adjective, so that someone who really is capable of executing a fairly dramatic threat, still they are under, to a degree, the permission and/or the authority of God. So don't be afraid of their threats. Do not be frightened. Most of the things that I do that I generally don't get what I wanted from, they happen as a result of fear. Maybe the better way for me to say this is, many of the things that I do when I am afraid don't get me what I hoped they would when I decided to do them. Now, the decision may have been made in a moment, but I still decided. I read an article one time that said 80% of what we fear will not happen. Only 20% will. And yet, I don't know about you, but in my life, I burn a gob of resources off fretting about, worrying about, planning against the things that I fear. My own story has a chapter in it that I hope to never return to in the same way. In my heart attack recovery, I've told this story before, but it's probably worth retelling in case there's someone new joining and they haven't heard it before. When I recovered from a heart attack in 2010 or 11, it gets fuzzy in my mind. It was 11. When I was in recovery, my cardiologist in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I had the heart attack, came into my room in the hospital to get me ready for discharge and so forth. And one of the things he said is, be prepared. Most people who have a significant heart event, and then he said, and by the way, you had a serious heart attack. I died and was revived 3 different times. That's fairly serious, I guess. Most people who have a serious heart event like you had experience depression. I was already familiar with depression. I had experienced it in my 30s and 40s, and probably a form of it even very often before that, but most intensely in my 30s and 40s, where I was my doctor prescribed Prozac for me, and it became part of my daily routine. And over time, it became less of a hindrance to my life. But I was familiar with it. I was also familiar with helping people with depression, because I seemed to become a little bit of a magnet for people struggling with depression. At any rate, I was prepared for the concept, for the idea that I would experience a measure of depression, and I had people in my life who were positioned so well because of their character and their loving nature that I didn't fear that. What I was not prepared for was the anxiety attacks that I experienced. They were debilitating. I think I can just say with confidence, I would never have imagined that I would experience anxiety attacks. I had known people that had anxiety attacks, and honestly, I kind of thought, that is a weird deal, and you should be able to just, okay, chill. No, you can't just chill. The anxiety attack is very real. It began with an agitation, and then a physical thing here in my left shoulder and the side of my neck, and then tingling in my hands and down my arms and down my legs. And so stuff that now I look at and I realize this was probably hyperventilation beginning, and it was a signal that the part of my brain that registers threat had hijacked the front part of my brain that decides what I will do about what is happening to me. Anyway, it's more complex than I have time to, unpack, and I'm really not qualified to unpack all the neurology of it. But I can tell you this, anxiety is real. Fear will motivate you in a way that almost nothing else can. This is part of God's gift to us for self-preservation. But here, Peter writes, don't let fear rule your life. And in a day when media and lots of outside external forces are trying to promote the idea that we've got to be afraid of this COVID thing. Well, there's a difference between me being afraid of this COVID thing and me being intelligent about a response toward a threat. I won't go further because it'll sound political if I do. I don't mean it politically. I'm just talking about learn how to evaluate fear for what it is. It should only stimulate me to be vigilant about my response. But if I become over vigilant and everything becomes a threat, that's disruptive to my life. And one of the outcomes of that is it makes me unavailable to do what God has created me to do. And it makes me unavailable to the mission that He has set me on to help other people discover their best life by discovering God's design and learning to follow it. Well, today was a lot more of a biography thing than a direct teaching, and I guess I apologize for that. But if it helped you, I won't apologize. I've gone way over time again. How does this happen? Well, I'll shut up. Bring somebody with you next time. Invite somebody to join us on So Care with Stevie Boy, and I hope we get to connect this way again next time.